Good afternoon to a very full room. It's great to see so many of you. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Westmont's first Erasmus lecture of 2014. I'd like to extend special thanks to the Provost's office, to the departments of English and Philosophy, the Gender Studies program, and to the Gady Center for the Liberal Arts for their support of this afternoon's speaker and the reception to follow in the lobby just outside of the room at the end of our time. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Amy Hollywood, who is the Elizabeth H. Monrad Professor of Christian Studies at Harvard Divinity School. Professor Hollywood joined the Harvard Divinity School faculty in 2005 after teaching at Rhodes College, Dartmouth College, and the University of Chicago. Her recent course offerings range widely and tantalizingly across the medieval and the contemporary at the threshold of the sacred and the secular. This year and next finds her teaching courses such as The History of Christian Thought in the Medieval West, Attention and Engagement in Contemporary American Poetry, Readings in 20th and 21st Century Theory, and Sex, Gender, and Sexuality. She is the author of several critically acclaimed studies. Her 2002 book, entitled Sensible Ecstasy, Mysticism, Sexual Difference, and the Demands of History, is likewise poised at the porous touching point of the past and present, emotional and intellectual. In that quite influential book, for example, the syllabus of my graduate course on mysticism was nearly organized around her thinking on the subject. She brings otherwise staunchly secular 20th century French intellectuals such as Georges Bataille, Simone de Beauvoir, Jacques Lacan, and Luce Irigaray into conversation with excessive forms of medieval mysticism embodied by women like Angela of Foligno, Hadjiewicz, and Teresa of Avila. She shows that these female mystics are significant to contemporary theorists for their unique, quote, ability to think outside of the restrictive oppositions that continue to afflict our understanding of subjectivity, the body, and sexual difference. Her first book, The Soul as Virgin Wife, Mechthild of Magdeburg, Marguerite Porete, and Meister Eckhart, received the Otto Grundler Prize for the Best Book in Medieval Studies from the International Congress of Medieval Studies. She is also the co-editor with Patricia Beckman of the Cambridge Companion to Christian Mysticism and Acute Melancholia and Other Essays. Professor Hollywood's current work explores the place of the mystical, often redescribed as enthusiasm, within modern philosophy, theology, and poetry. Her talk today is entitled The Mystery of Trauma, the Mystery of Joy. We are honored to have Dr. Amy Hollywood with us this afternoon. Professor Hollywood, welcome.
Okay, how to make the water and the, okay. That should go down there. Okay. I just was having an animated discussion about the Seahawks, and so it's going to be a little hard for me to switch gears. The mystery of trauma, the mystery of joy will be enacted on Sunday. We'll find out which of those two it will be for people in my household, long-suffering Seattle Seahawks fans. Anyway, sorry. My thanks to Jamie for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And you guys, I mean, it's really nice outside. But I guess you're used to that, so you come in for lectures despite that. I personally would be outside if I had a choice, but I don't have a choice today. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is some issues in the ways that we do the history of the Middle Ages, and some of the affective or emotional dimensions that I think play out into what we're interested in when we look at the Middle Ages, and what perhaps we should be interested in, or what might be interesting in the Middle Ages that we ignore. So I'm going to start by talking about some issues in contemporary theory, and then tie that back to a particular medieval example, the life of Christina the Astonishing, the aptly named Christina the Astonishing, which is a saint's life written by Thomas of Cantimpré. No one here will likely have heard of it, and that's okay, because most people haven't. I'll tell you enough about it, I hope, to make it interesting. But before that, some contemporary issues. With characteristic perspicuity, in 1996, the art critic Hal Foster noted the ambiguities involved in the theoretical elevation of the category of trauma. And 1996 was a signal year for trauma. There were so many important books that came out about trauma across the humanities, social sciences, and sciences. And Foster is noting what's odd and interesting about this at the very moment it's happening. This is Hal Foster. I'm going to read a longish quote. On the one hand, he says, in art and theory, trauma discourse continues the post-structuralist critique of the subject by other means. For again, in a psychoanalytic register, there is no subject of trauma. The position is evacuated, and in this sense, the critique of the subject is most radical here. On the other hand, in popular culture, trauma is treated as an event that guarantees the subject, and in this psychologistic register, the subject, however disturbed, rushes back as witness, testifier, survivor. Here is indeed a traumatic subject, and it has absolute authority, for one cannot challenge the trauma of another. One can believe it, one can identify with it, or not. In trauma discourse, then, the subject is evacuated and elevated at the same time. And in this way, trauma discourse magically resolves two contradictory imperatives in culture today: deconstructive analysis and identity politics. This strange rebirth of the author, this paradoxical condition of absent authority, is a significant turn in contemporary art, criticism, and cultural politics. Okay, so the second of the two hands that Foster puts forward might seem the most self-evident, and despite criticism, it continues to shape politics in all of its forms, and academic politics and academic work. Although we know from the work of scholars like Alan Young, Ruth Lees, French anthropologist Didier Fasson, Richard Ruckman, and others, that trauma, and in particular the kinds of responses to traumatic events associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, has a history. We continue to operate with the broad ethical injunction articulated by work around the diagnosis that emerges in the 1980s and 1990s. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't a recognized psychological disorder until after the Vietnam War. And the politics of getting it into the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, has been the subject of analysis by Alan Young and others. In the United States, the psychologist Judith Herman, in her book Trauma and Recovery, The Aftermath of Violence from Domestic Abuse to Political Terror, which appeared in 1992, insists that the first thing one must do in response to the violence suffered by another is to believe that it happened. Herman writes within a therapeutic context, but the injunction to believe operates much more broadly, from the political realm to the historical. With it comes the privileging of the survivor, and that category of the survivor, as the one who knows, the one who has access to the historical reality of violence in a way that demands political, ethical, and historiographical fidelity. This in turn leads to a tendency to read people from marginalized or underrepresented groups as victims, and to give them epistemic privilege insofar as they are victims. In fact, to claim, or not to claim, to presume that the epistemic privilege and the political privilege of marginalized or underrepresented groups is dependent upon their proximity to or their suffering of trauma. There have been a lot of challenges to the tenability of this stance, yet it endures. Water. The accusations of satanic ritual abuse in the 1990s, a lot of you guys probably don't remember this, but at the moment, in the 90s, there were these accusations. Some of it's coming back in the news because there's people who just got out of jail, two caretakers of young children who had been accused of ritual satanic abuse in a daycare center and were imprisoned for years, and they just got out. And so some of this has come back in the news because of that. And one of the things you'll see if you read some of the articles about this is that the accusations came from young children who were most likely led into accounts of what was happening to them by adults who wanted to read the situation in a particular way. So the accusations of satanic ritual abuse in the 1990s, for example, demonstrated just how dangerous the ethical injunction to believe might become. The debates around Benjamin Wilkomirski's Fragments, Memories of a Wartime Childhood, which appeared in 1995, highlights the continuing dynamic of a certain will to believe, even as it raises the same questions about the limits of the will to believe. Wilkomirski's Fragments purports to be the memories of an adult remembering his childhood in Auschwitz, in the camps, in the death camps. Yet research, immediately questions were raised about the authenticity or the truth of these claims. And Wilkomersky says, well, they're childhood memories, they're murky, but this is what happened to me. What happened then was that the press who published the book commissioned an historian to go look and try to figure out what they could about Wilkomersky and about the truth of his story. And so this guy who's a journalist and historian, Stefan Machler, in a longer book about fragments, he demonstrates that Wilkomersky was not a guy named Benjamin Wilkomersky, that he was in fact a Swiss guy named Bruno Grosjean, and that Grosjean had transmuted aspects of his own childhood into a fictional account of a childhood in the Holocaust. Machler doesn't simply, and this is the part that is important for me, Machler doesn't argue that Wilkomersky made up his story of childhood trauma, that he wrote fiction, or that he lied. Instead, Machler suggests that there was something of Grosjean's own putatively traumatic childhood that was visible in fragments and transmuted into a story about the Holocaust. So some aspect of the real is acknowledged and maintained to be true, even by Stefan Machler, who is Grosjean's greatest critic. Some aspect of the story is real, and the aspect of the story that is taken to be real is the trauma, right? So the view is, whatever Benjamin Wilkomersky's story is, something terrible happened to him, whether it's what he said it was or not. And I'm kind of like, why are we assuming something terrible happened to him when we can demonstrate that he is not who he says he is, when we can demonstrate that the things that he talks about in the book are not the things that happened to him? This leads to the other side of the paradox laid out by Foster. For at the heart of the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder lies the notion that one dissociates or represses the trauma, that in some real way one does not experience it. Now, there's two different models of trauma operating with the terms dissociation and the term repression. In dissociation, the idea is that when undergoing a traumatic event, when something terrible is happening to you, you can kind of stand outside of yourself. And people will often talk about extreme situations of violence or of rape, where they'll know what's happening to them, but feel as if they're watching it from across the room. So there's this phenomenological account of being at a distance from oneself, even as one knows what is happening to one. And that is seen as a kind of psychological protective strategy whereby one can survive certain forms of extreme violence, extreme abuse, and trauma. And then the traumatic, the therapeutic question is, how can we rejoin up that person across the room watching with the one who's undergone the suffering? So that how can you begin to feel that which you have undergone is seen, and that's seen as being important to the healing of the various symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's a model of dissociation that's associated with Pierre Janet and others, and it's the one that Judith Herman uses in her very influential book that I just mentioned. On the other hand, there's the notion of repression, which is from Freud, and is the idea that, in fact, when something terrible happens to you, you either, it's complicated, you either repress it such that you don't even remember that it happened. That's kind of a crappy reading of Freud, but it's one that's very predominant. Or you somehow distort or change or work the memory such that it becomes something you can live with, even if it's not exactly what happened. And the work of therapy then is a work of learning how to speak the truth of one's experience, which in some ways for Freud you're creating through the engagement with the therapist. It's a complicated notion. The simplistic notion that was very popular in the 90s was that you repress, the memory's gone, and then through various therapeutic procedures, including hypnosis, which Freud never would have used, you suddenly can remember, and in that remembering, cure occurs. And that's the model that was, broadly speaking, talked about within certain psychoanalytic circles in the 80s and 90s. It's associated with Freud, I think, incorrectly, but, because Freud early on was hypnotizing people, and then he's like, it doesn't work, it doesn't last. And so he went for a more complicated notion of repression. But the point to be is that there's this dissociation model and there's this repression model, and that what they both have in common is what Hal Foster points to, which is that in some way, in some complex way, you aren't present for your own suffering, right? Such a complex understanding of the relationship between subjectivity, memory, and trauma is operative in Mockler's work on Grosjean and Wilkomersky, even if only implicitly. So the assumption is he remembers, but he doesn't remember. He was there, but he wasn't there. He gets the story right, but he doesn't get the story right, both at the same time. And on the one hand, he has an eyewitness's authority in terms of this happened to me, so we have to believe him. But on the other hand, he didn't really undergo his own experience because he was too young, it was too traumatic, it was too overwhelming. And so in that case, he's going to get the story wrong, and it will read as a almost a fictional account. And so that both of those things are in play still in the conversations about Wilkomersky. So, my question is, if trauma so overwhelms the subject as to render him or her unable to experience it, how can one ever adequately name it in the process of testifying, right? Is there something about the testimony of the survivor that makes it simultaneously inadequate to its object and impossible ethically to disbelieve? And that seems to be the place we're left with discussions like that of Wilkomersky's book. But it's part of a much more broad-ranging phenomenon. The historian Dominic LeCapra, in a series of important essays on the role of trauma theory and testimonial in the writing of history, points to an uncanny parallel between contemporary theoretical and historiographical discussions of trauma and what he calls negative theology. What worries LeCapra is what he describes as, quote, an important tendency in modern culture and thought to convert trauma into the occasion for sublimity, to transvalue it into a test of the self or of the group and an entry into the extraordinary. In the sublime, the excess of trauma becomes an uncanny source of elation or ecstasy. Just an aside, LeCapra is clearly thinking here of an essay by Georges Bataille on Hiroshima. If anybody's interested in that, I can talk about it. But LeCapra goes on to say that even such events as the Holocaust or the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, quote, may become occasions of negative sublimity or displaced sacralization. They may also give rise to what may be termed founding traumas, traumas that paradoxically become the valorized or intensely cathected basis of identity for an individual or a group, rather than events that pose the problematic question of identity. And with this comes the notion that the more unspeakable the event, the more sublime the experience of the event, the more authentic it is. There's some kind of equation of trauma, sublimity, and authenticity that's operative here. Now, LeCapra recognizes the implicitly theological language that surrounds much contemporary discussions of trauma, and he uses it as a basis for a careful critique. Quote, some of the most powerful forms of modern art and writing, as well as some of the most compelling forms of criticism, including, he says, deconstruction, often seem to be traumatic writing or post-traumatic writing in closest proximity to trauma. They may also involve the feeling of keeping faith with trauma in a manner that leads to a compulsive preoccupation with aporia, an endlessly melancholic, impossible mourning, and a resistance to working through. I think one is involved here in more or less secularized displacements of the sacred and its paradoxes. The hiddenness, death, or absence of a radically transcendent divinity or of absolute foundations makes of existence a fundamentally traumatic scene in which anxiety threatens to color and perhaps confuse all relations. One's relation to every other, instead of involving a tense, at times paradoxical interaction of proximity and distance, solidarity and criticism, trust and wariness, may be figured on the model of one's anxiety-ridden relation without relation to a traditionally transcendent, now perhaps recognized as absence, divinity, who is totally other. End quote. In the absence of death, in the absence of death, if only. In the absence of God, LeCapra asks, has secular art and criticism and certain forms of secular politics made trauma itself sacred? Have pain and violence and anxiety become the real to the exclusion of all else? And what does that mean for how we listen to each other, for who we determine to be worth listening to, and for what we can hear them or deem worthy of hearing them say? What I want to ask today is whether returning to the Middle Ages, to the discourses of cataphatic, the naming of God, and apophatic, the unnaming or unsaying or negation of God, theology, as they are articulated around the life stories of saintly women and men, may help us to understand our contemporary dilemma and pose a possible alternative to it. One point is just to make the obvious point that the fascination with trauma does not depend on the death of God, putative or otherwise. That the fascination with trauma runs throughout medieval Christian text, on which I work, and I want to point to particularly telling and extreme example of that. The other thing I want to point to is next to that fascination with trauma or with extraordinary experiences of pain and suffering goes an extremity of joy. And I want to ask how and why it is that modern historians have taken as real in medieval texts the traumatic and often been unable to see as real or understand as historiographically important the solicitation and the enactment of joy within some of these same texts. So that's what I'm after here. I'm going to use an extreme example, a story one would assume that very few modern historians would believe, and yet one that many have attempted to read in terms of hysteria or trauma, in terms of a suffering that is real even if the events recorded about that suffering are taken as hyperbolic. I will turn then to the life of Christina the Astonishing. It's absolutely what it's called, Christina Mirabilis. Christina the Astonishing, written by Thomas of Cantimpré in the year shortly after her death. She died in 1224. The life is written in 1232. Quick note on the hagiography. Hagiography is just a fancy word we use for the lives of the saints. It's initially just meant holy writing. In the Middle Ages, hagiography meant biblical text. It only begins to mean lives of the saints in the 19th century. In the 19th century, the term hagiography, all holy writing, was narrowed to refer to a particular kind of holy writing, namely the lives of the saints. Now, many scholars would argue that hagiography is precisely not history, and that the stories told within them are not meant to be read in the ways that we read historical or what some call proto-historical documents. What matters, so it is said, is the holiness of the person in question, and that holiness is one shared by all of the saints. Hence, you can move material from one hagiography to another without concern for misrepresentation. This is true. We see medieval authors doing this all the time. For all saints participate in that singular life of sanctity that is perfection in Christ. Yet despite such claims, and historians will say, we can't read these as historical documents, and then say, oh, what can we learn historically from these documents? Often from one paragraph to the next. Yet despite these claims, historians continue to read hagiographical sources for historical material, either about what was considered to be holy in a particular time and place, that's one way to get around the issue, or as telling us something about the person under discussion once we cut out all of the supernatural, generic, or typological material. This is a very dubious enterprise, but one that is particularly rife in the study material on women from the High and later Middle Ages, a time when we have hagiographies written in close proximity to the death of their subjects, and often with explicit claims to direct or indirect knowledge of their subjects. We will see in what follows how this plays out in the life of Christina the Astonishing. Thomas is like, I knew her, I saw this. He keeps saying this over and over again. It needs to be said at the outset, I think I already said it, I'll say it again, that the life of Christina the Astonishing reads like science fiction. It's very hard to believe that anyone ever believed it, to the point that I've at times wondered if it wasn't fictional, and known to be fictional by its first audiences. Thomas knows people are going to find it hard to believe. He himself, moreover, he doesn't claim to have known Christina, but he claims to have known people who knew Christina. He tells us that he wouldn't even have written the life if another priest, the widely known and respected James of Vitry, who became an archbishop and a cardinal in the Roman Curia, he was a big man, right? Thomas says, I wouldn't even have written this life of Christina if James of Vitry hadn't already mentioned Christina in the prologue to his life of the holy woman Marie of Oignies. So the view is, I didn't know her, but this guy who's in the Curia now knew her, so we should believe. Thomas opens the life of Christina the Astonishing with a quotation. He cites this passage from James of Vitry's life of Marie of Oignies. And this is James in the earlier life as cited by Thomas. He says, he's talking about seeing all these groups of, droves of holy women experiencing ecstatic pleasure with God, being wrapped in the Spirit for days on end, devoting their lives to lives of Christian perfection in miraculous ways. So it's in the midst of this long discussion of all these holy women in the Low Countries that James says this. I saw another woman in whom God worked so wondrously that after she had lain dead for a long time, but before her body was buried in the ground, which was lucky, her soul returned to her body and she lived again. It would have been a bummer if she was already buried. But anyway, okay. She obtained from the Lord that she would endure purgatory, living in this world in her body. It was for this reason that she was afflicted for a long time by the Lord, so that sometimes she rolled herself in the fire, and sometimes in the winter she remained for lengthy periods in icy water, and at other times she was driven to enter the tombs of the dead. But after she had performed penance in so many ways, she lived in peace and merited grace from the Lord, and many times, wrapped in the Spirit, she led the souls of the dead as far as purgatory, or through purgatory as far as the kingdom of heaven, without any harm to herself." End quote. This is James, as cited by Thomas. All of this might strike us as implying a certain credulity on James's part, while at the same time being plausible as an account of what one woman and those around her believed about her experience. The very framing of the prologue to the life of Marie of Oignies works to reinforce this reading, as it is addressed by James to Fulk, the Bishop of Toulouse, with whom James describes having seen Christina and the other holy women of Liège, about whom James writes. This addressee also points to the specific religious polemic framework within which the life of Christina the life of Marie of Oignies was written, but that's another point. Thomas insists, moreover, that he has not only the written testimony of James, but also many other eyewitness accounts of Christina's deeds and of her words. Quote, "I have as many witnesses to most of the events I've described as there were rational persons living at that time in the town of Saint-Trond. These things were not done in narrow corners, but openly among the people. Nor had so much time elapsed that oblivion has swallowed up and buried these occurrences, for I wrote this life not more than 8 years after her death. I personally heard other things that no one would have known except Christina herself from people who swore they had learned them from her own mouth." End quote. Now remember, this is a story about a woman who claims to have died and come back to life. Okay, so what do we do with the care with which Thomas notes the abundance of eyewitness accounts, including that of a bishop and future member of the Roman Curia? Thomas knows the story is unbelievable, yet he persists in telling it and in doing everything he can to vouch for its authority. So should we pass this off as just another example of medieval credulity? Or might Thomas be trying, like many contemporary historians dealing with the aftermath of catastrophic events, to trust his sources and to augment what he knows of Christina's speech from what he heard from those around her? What role does unspeakability play here? What role is there for trauma? And how does the traumatic lend a certain authenticity to aspects of Christina's story for a modern audience and for a medieval audience, frankly? And might there be unspeakable aspects of her text that modern readers are less likely to hear and or to understand in the way Christina and her contemporaries themselves understood them? And Thomas, I should say, also understood them. The life of Christina begins with a death and a resurrection. Rather than working towards the miraculous, it begins with an event so wonderful as to test the credulity of the most faithful readers. The text also begins with a test of love, whose fruits it then recounts. According to Thomas, the strength of Christina's desire for God leads to her death. She's one of 3 sisters who's left an orphan. She's given the crappy job of taking care of the cow in the field, and she's given the least of the jobs. But she spends her time with the cow in the field, meditating upon Christ's perfection, and so fully enraptured by Christ that she wants to die, and she does. And when she dies, according to Thomas's text, her beloved, Christ, immediately asks for her self-sacrifice. We know this, Thomas writes, because this is what Christina herself told those she encountered when she returned to life. Thomas gives us a version of these words, a long discourse purportedly from the mouth of the newly arisen Christina. So what happens is the coffin's in the church. They're getting ready to bury her. They're saying the Mass. And she pops up. And she's like, "Hey, not dead." And they say, "Where were you? What happened?" And she tells them the story about having been led through what she thought was hell because of the torments that the soul she saw were undergoing, and then being led to Christ. And at that point, Christ says to her, "There's no souls in hell, they were in purgatory." And he says this. He says, "Certainly, my dearest," this is what Christina purportedly says Christ told her, "Certainly, my dearest, you will be with me, Christ. But I now offer you 2 choices, either to remain with me now, or to return to the body and suffer there the suffering of an immortal soul in a mortal body, without damage to that body. And by these your sufferings to deliver all those souls on whom you had compassion in that place of purgatory." So she can get all these people out of purgatory. "And by the example of your suffering and your way of life, to convert living human beings to me, and to get them to turn aside from their sins. And after you have done all of these things, to return to me, having accumulated for yourself a reward of such great profit." End quote. Christina's love of God and her love of others leads her to acquiesce to his request. She comes back to life during the funeral service and begins, quote, "to do those things for which she had been sent back by the Lord," end quote. She thrust herself, in Thomas's version, a more intense version of what James gives us, she thrusts herself into fiery ovens where bread is being baked. She throws herself into roaring fires. She jumps into cauldrons of boiling water or immerses herself in the freezing waters of the local river for days at a time. All of these torments are experienced as excruciatingly painful. Her howls, Thomas reports, were terrible to hear. Yet her body remains unmarked by her self-torture. So sensitive and light that when praying she floats to the tops of trees or church steeples, unable to bear the stench of human beings and the weight of the earth. Christina's body shares in features of the resurrected body. It has to, otherwise she'd die from doing all this stuff. Not surprisingly, Christina's family and neighbors are distressed by her actions. They were kind of like, what are you doing, right? And they thought she was possessed by demons. It's one of the available explanations in the 13th century. They misinterpret Christina's actions in ways Thomas anticipates his readers will misinterpret his text. Her sisters and neighbors repeatedly capture and chain Christina down, attempting to curtail her self-harm. Yet God takes care of her bodily needs. Her virginal breast drips sweet milk and later sweet oil to sustain her during her imprisonment. And eventually God restores her freedom. He loosens the chains. After having acted out her purgatorial suffering before crowds of people, moreover, she prays to God that her actions might become more moderate. They do so, and she is accepted as a prophetic figure in the community. As the historian Robert Sweetman shows, Christina's prophetic and preaching mission is effected through both her words and her actions. More importantly, or most importantly, her dramatic bodily displays are themselves part of her preaching apostolate, her preaching mission. Through the extremity of her suffering, Christina demonstrates to onlookers the effects of sin. This is what's going to happen to you if you keep doing what you're doing. This is what purgatory is going to look like, and the horrors of purgatorial suffering. In this way, she warns them not to continue in their sins and to turn towards repentance. There's a progression in Thomas's account of Christina's life, though. First, she must prove her sanctity through bodily suffering. So she first preaches through what she does. And only then are her prophetic, and I would add mystical powers, accepted by the community so that she can preach through words. These prophetic powers first evince themselves through her action. Christina begs door to door for her food, yet anything she receives that has been obtained by its donor through sin is rejected, vomited up by her body. Only later do we see her discussing events that occur at a distance, being prophetic through words, or in the future, and telling people of the fate of the dead and dying. At a time when women's words were distrusted and their ability to teach, preach, and interpret scripture severely limited, Christina's bodily actions give her a religious authority otherwise unavailable to her. Only after her dramatic bodily suffering could she teach with words. So she first has to go through this purgatorial, intense pain, and then it can calm down and she can be presented as a person who preaches and teaches with language. Okay, so there's more that can be said about the life, but I want to get to the trauma issue. In a recent analysis of Thomas's life of Christina, the literary critic and historian Barbara Newman argues, and she's a great literary critic and historian, but I really disagree with her about this text. She argues that there is a good reason to understand Christina's behavior in terms of hysteria. Newman doesn't explicitly say this. She doesn't explicitly extend the argument beyond Christina, but it seems a plausible extension of her argument given the commonality of the symptoms that appear in the various vita of women. So in Christina's text and then across a whole other set of lives of women, we see certain symptoms or certain phenomena, let's call them as, depathologized. Catatonia and trances, paralysis, inability to speak or involuntary locutions, inability not to speak, to say certain things, coughing, production of excessive phlegm and other bodily fluids. All of these are things that are associated in the 19th and 20th century with hysteria. Some of them will be associated with post-traumatic stress disorder in the late 20th century. And they're all things that we find throughout the hagiographies of these women in the 13th century. Like James of Vitry, Thomas describes Christina as engaging in a host of activities similar to those found in 19th and early 20th century cases of hysteria. Death-like trances, levitation, extreme asceticism, self-exorcisms, screams, tears, bodily contortions. Once, in grief over the damnation of sinners, Christina, quote, wept and twisted herself and bent herself backward and bent and rebent her arms and fingers as if they were pliable and had no bones, end quote. Or another time she cried out as if in childbirth and twisted her limbs and rolled about on the ground with great wailing, end quote. There's photographic representations of 19th century hysterics in poses that this could be the verbal description of them. Just so I'm saying, there are very close parallels between what Christina is described as physically doing and the photographs of hysterics taken at the Salpêtrière under the guidance of Jean-Martin Charcot in the late 19th century. These are photographs in which a small number of hysterical women exhibit extreme bodily contortions and spasms, and that's taken to be a key mark of their hysteria. Hence, for Newman, it is not surprising that Christina is a figure of fear and consternation to the townspeople of Saint-Trond, who assume that she is mad or possessed by demons, as the Middle English version of the Life puts it, says explicitly. As I've argued, Thomas depicts Christina's post-resurrection life as a long exemplum through which she instructs others, and at the same time frees souls from purgatory through her suffering. She provides a theatrical depiction of purgatorial pain and of post-resurrection bodily lightness and joy, thereby teaching through her deeds, as she will eventually come to preach through her words. Yet for Newman, this explanation of the life of Christina the Astonishing seems insufficient, for Newman wants to understand the person behind the text, one whose extreme actions and bodily symptoms seem pathological to modern readers. We need to ask why, Newman claims, quote, Thomas of Canterbury took the risk of representing the village lunatic as a saint, end quote. That's the framework within which Newman is operating. But what is at stake, I would ask, for modern historians in accepting 19th and 20th century evaluations of Christina and other holy women as mentally ill, and in particular as hysterical? The association of medieval women's sanctity and the forms of mysticism most often found among women with hysteria runs throughout the modern literature on both phenomena. The neurologist who I named earlier, Jean-Martin Charcot, who died in 1893, so he was prominent throughout the late 19th century, so important in the modern medical study of moral degeneration, study of hysteria, for his insistence that hysteria is a disease of the nerves rather than a sign of moral degeneration, malingering, or laziness, first introduced the reading of mysticism as hysteria in a long essay called Le Foi qui guérit, the faith that heals, written shortly before his death. There he argued that Francis of Assisi and Teresa of Avila were undeniably hysterics, with the ability nonetheless to cure hysteria in others. And he was interested in this disease that one could have, and the having of it gave one the ability to cure it. That was what interested him about this. The association of mysticism, particularly the visionary and somatic forms of mysticism most often associated with women, and hysteria was used throughout the early 20th century to disparage and denigrate women's experience in writing. Simone de Beauvoir, for example, the early 20th century philosopher, distinguishes between the mysticism of Saint Teresa, who was a 16th century Spanish mystic. Beauvoir distinguishes between the mysticism of Teresa, which she refers to as the product of a, quote, sane, free consciousness, and that of her lesser sisters. Beauvoir interprets the mysticism of Angela Foligno, Jean Guyon, and others as a form of erotomania and hysteria. The two are often indistinguishable in the psychoanalytic literature, with hysteria understood in a broadly Freudian sense. And she certainly would have put Christina the Astonishing in the same place. The hysteric, for Freud, is one who suffers bodily symptoms she or he does not know how to interpret. These symptoms mark the return of traumas and or desires that, due to the force of repression, can appear only in veiled forms, and so are not immediately legible. Thus, for Beauvoir, whereas Teresa controls her bodily, sexualized experiences of the divine, a claim Teresa would find very surprising, by the way, the bodies of other women, like Christina, although Beauvoir didn't know Christina, but we can put her in this category, the bodies of other women signify without their conscious consent and without their knowledge of the body's meanings, a sign of degradation for Beauvoir. Beauvoir's feminist analysis leaves room for a distinction between hysteria and mysticism, even as she assimilates most examples of female mysticism to the former degraded category. Most scholars who have wanted to take mysticism seriously have, as a result, either avoided the term hysteria entirely or have reserved it for those figures seen as somehow marginal, excessive, or troubling. Not surprisingly, then, the term has recently reemerged around women who display a particularly somatic mysticism, namely figures like Christina the Astonishing, for whom we have, it should be emphasized, only a hagiography written by a man who did not know her. Another famous example, the person a lot of people talk about when they talk about mysticism and hysteria, is the English woman Marjorie Kemp. Yet his attention to other saints' lives, the other saints' lives produced in the Low Countries in the 13th century, suggests the forms of divine possession seen in the life of Christina the Astonishing differ only in degree from those ascribed to other women. So it's not that Christina is anomalous, she's a more extreme version of what we see in lots of other places. So how does that affect how we read this text? Now, here's Newman's hypothesis. To get back to Newman. Newman hypothesizes that Christina, having survived an unknown illness and death-like coma, shows signs of severe mental disturbance. Quote, antisocial behavior, violent self-mutilation, peculiar and repellent choices in food and dress, end quote. The people of St. Trond, the town where she lives, judging her to be ill or possessed, attempt to restrain her, make her a public spectacle, and have her exorcised, all exercised like to get the demons out of her, not exercise as in to get skinny, all to no avail. She remains an unassimilable madwoman, reduced to begging to stay alive, an act which, according to Newman, at that point would have had no religious significance for Christina or her neighbors. I find that very hard to believe, but regardless. Into this wretched existence, Newman writes, came a cleric. This is Newman's language. Into this wretched existence came a cleric. Seeing Christina's extravagant suffering, he assimilated them to the mortifications offered by women like Marie of Oignies for the benefit of souls, and devised a new interpretation of her state. Christina was indeed tormented, but her torments now had meaning. She was a madwoman with a mission. Under the tutelage of this priest and his circle, Christina became increasingly pious and began to model her behavior, insofar as she could control it, on the devotion of other lay holy women. End quote. Thus, by what Newman calls a stroke of pastoral genius, the bodily pathologies of an hysterical woman, are transformed into a theologically coherent glimpse of the next world. Newman thus argues that the theological value of Christina's hysterical experience is read into it by a male advisor. Only then does it take on religious significance, and then, I guess, become something other than hysteria. Despite their extremity, Christina's actions, like those of other women discussed in James of Vitry's prologue, conform to, and here's my argument against this. I mean, the most obvious argument against this is if there was a male pastor, a male preacher who had come along and explained Christina to herself, Thomas most certainly would have told us about it. He has other hagiographies in which he talks about the relationship between a male preacher and a female saint, two that are devoted almost entirely to that subject matter. So it's not like he was averse to talking about the ways in which interactions between men and women could affect the religious lives of both. His Life of Lucard of Ariès is about his own relationship to a Cistercian nun and her intense visionary experience, and then he wrote a shorter Life of Margaret of Ypres, which is about the intense relationship between a young Beguine and a priest who advises her and helps her to understand and shape her experience. So if there really had been a guy who came in and saw Christina and said, oh, this is what's going on, there's no reason Thomas wouldn't have told us that. In fact, the only evidence we get of Christina's interaction with other religious people is her interactions with a group of Cistercian nuns, which I'll come back to, and her interaction with a woman who lived as a hermit, about whom we have a vita, about whom we know stuff from another life. And so if anybody helped her to understand her experience and to think theologically about what was happening to her, it most likely would have been other women. Aveta Huiz, who's the hermitess with whom Christina appears to have lived for a while, or the Cistercian nuns with whom she had very active interactions throughout her life. So there's a question of absence. Like if there really is this, great moment of reinterpretation, why wouldn't Thomas have told us about it? If it had been done by a priest or a Dominican, certainly he would have named that person. And what's at stake for Newman in needing to have that kind of revelatory moment come from the outside, to have Christina's experience rendered theologically salient by someone external to herself, right? There has to be a saving presence. That's the part I don't get. And the other part is that despite the extremity of Christina's actions, the extremity of Christina's actions are not different in kind from that of other women discussed in James of Vitry's prologue to the Life of Marie of Oignies. And all of these accounts conform to 13th century understandings of religious experience. The historian Diane Elliott shows that for 13th century philosophers, like Alexander of Hale and William of Auvergne and Thomas Aquinas, names don't matter. They all use the terms rapture, ecstasy, raptus, ecstasis, and alienation, alienatio, or departure of the mind, to connote the alienation from the senses that occurs during an encounter with the higher spirit. All right, so they all talk about something very similar to what is seen in these vita. Debate about the nature of such experiences focuses on Paul's description of being caught up into the third heaven in 2 Corinthians 12, 2-4. So if you want to look at how the philosophers and theologians talk about this, you can go look at how they talk about 2 Corinthians 12, 2-4, because what does it mean when Paul says, I was caught up into the third heavens? That's this state of rapture, ecstasy, that is also used to describe these women. Following Augustine's distinction between corporeal, spiritual, and intellectual vision, most medieval scholars agreed that Paul describes an unmediated experience of intellectual vision, one that does not depend on images. The general belief was such that intellectual vision, and even the lesser experiences of spiritual vision, where you saw through images, depended on an alienation from the body, certainly of the sensitive faculty of the soul, if not of the vegetative faculty, the animating principle itself. You had to somehow come out of yourself to have this experience. When, in the 13th century, these monastic ideas come together with the medical discourses on the physical effects of love, in William of Auvergne and others, this becomes a notion of love sickness. And love sickness for Christ is a kind of love sickness that is seen as not pathological, but actually that which is most desired by those who seek perfection in Christ. The alienation of the mind or the senses then gives rise to a trance-like state and a death-like appearance. These women and some men all look like they're dead. As Bernard McGinn points out, moreover, James of Vitry's Life of Marie of Oignies is the first text to use language traditionally associated with the heights of monastic contemplation. To be separated from the body, to be abstracted from the senses, to be in a rapturous excess standing outside of oneself. For these trance-like states, and for trance-like states that last not just for a few minutes, but among these women for hours and sometimes days at a time. So whereas earlier monastic literature emphasized the brevity of this moment, James depicts Marie and other women remaining in trance-like states for hours, days, sometimes days on end. So in the 13th century medical, philosophical, and theological literature, women's bodies were seen as permeable and as such particularly suited to such raptures. They were supposed to be more porous, permeable, and weaker than men's. But that weakness meant that they were more open to possession by God, as well as to demonic possession. In addition, the great humidity and softness of women's bodies was taken as making them more impressionable and so more imaginative. Although often a source of problems for women, this imaginative capacity could also make them more open to spiritual visions. However, hysteria, or suffocation of the womb, hysteria was understood not as a psychological category in the Middle Ages, but as a physical category. Hysteria comes from the word hysteron, which is womb, or uterus, and the medieval conception of hysteria was that your uterus moved up and knocked your heart out and made you pass out. Quite literally. And hysteria, or suffocation of the womb, was also known to medieval thinkers as a pathological condition almost indistinguishable from rapture or demonic possessions. It was widely believed that the absence of sex permitted corrupt humors to build up so that the womb actually rises and presses against the heart, giving rise to a death-like appearance. Even Thomas of Canterbury recognizes that death-like trances might be the sign of bodily illnesses rather than of mystical rapture. And for Thomas and increasingly many others, demonic possession becomes another possibility, almost completely indistinguishable from divine rapture or ecstasy. Therefore, theologians and spiritual advisors, male and female, needed to be adept at interpreting bodily signs in order to determine if they were caused by rapture in God, demonic possession, or simply by a misplaced uterus. All of these possibilities were open. Newman's recuperation of the category of hysteria to discuss demonic possession and at least some examples of mystical experience raises the question of who is authorized to interpret these bodily phenomena. One of the commentators on Pseudo Albert the Great's Women's Secrets shows the conflicts of interpretation and how they were already at work in the medieval period. Women who suffer from suffocation of the womb, he writes, and this is the quote, they lie down as if they are dead. Old women who have recovered from it say that it was caused by an ecstasy, during which they were snatched out of their bodies and borne to heaven or to hell. But this is ridiculous. This guy's a doctor, right? He's a philosopher, a natural philosopher. The illness happens from natural causes. However, they think they've been snatched out of their bodies because vapors rise to their brains. If these vapors are very thick and cloudy, it appears to them that they are in hell, and they see black demons. If the vapors are light, it seems to them that they are in heaven, and that they see God and God's angels shining brightly, end quote. Here we see a case where women offered theological interpretations of their hysteria that are rejected by a male authority. The obvious question with regard to Newman's reading of the life of Christina is why we should suppose, given the absence of any account of such a mediating influence, that Christina herself did not interpret her experience theologically. The first chapter of Thomas's life, in fact, gives her account of what occurred to her, starkly reminiscent of the kinds of reports Albert describes above. As soon as I died, angels of God, the the ministers of light, received my soul and led me into a dark and terrible spot, which was filled with the souls of human beings. Here we have one of these old ladies who passes out and thinks she sees darkness, and so she thinks she sees hell, right? The torments that I saw in that place were so many and so cruel that no tongue is adequate to tell them. There I saw many dead human beings whom I had previously known in the flesh, but she elaborates on it, right? Having not a little compassion on these wretched souls, I asked them what place this was. I thought it was hell, but my guide said to me, this place is purgatory, and it is here that repentant sinners atone for the sins they committed while they were alive. They then led me to the torments of hell, and there I also recognized some people whom I had known while I was alive. After these events, I was carried into paradise, to the throne of the divine majesty. So, while Christina may have needed male clerical approbation to sanction her interpretation, although there's no evidence within either the life of Marie of Oigny or the life of Christina to suggest that she had such male approbation, she didn't develop this interpretation of her experience. It appears that she developed this interpretation of her experience on her own. As I said, the only possible influences depicted in the Vita or in the life are the nuns of St. Catherine's, the Cistercian abbey outside of St. Trond, and the recluse Yvette of Huy. So Newman's reading appears to rest on assumptions like those of Freud and Beauvoir, that what is most salient about hysteria is less its symptomology than the victim's lack of consciousness with regard to the cause of her symptoms. And this is where we come back to the tie-in to trauma. To label Christina and the demoniacs, who Newman also analyzes in her essay, as hysterical seems to presume that they had no available interpretive framework for their experience. When one is provided by a priest, Newman argues, hysteria takes on meaning, becomes theologized, and is transformed into religion. Newman's hysteric, then, is one who cannot read her symptoms, or as the author of Women's Secrets, the medical text I just cited, shows, who interpret them incorrectly. Yet Women's Secrets offer, like the life of Christina the Astonishing, contradicts Newman's thesis, suggesting that women both desired and were able to interpret their own symptoms, their own experiences, even if at times in the face of male resistance. Perhaps Thomas, in telling Christina's story, is more true to her testimony than Newman can allow herself to be. Now, Simone de Beauvoir asks whether the mystic submits to bodily symptoms or controls them with a sane, free consciousness. This is a very particular philosophical stance that Beauvoir has. For medieval women and men, however, this poses the far too stark a contrast. Women like Christina presumably understood themselves as overpowered by an experience beyond their control. This is the way contemporary texts by women talk about such raptures. Contemporary, I mean 13th century. Yet there is evidence that they struggle to maintain the authority to interpret that experience against the often competing claims of male medical and ecclesial authorities. Now I'm coming to the just last little bit. Most importantly for my purposes today, these experiences are not only, and perhaps not even primarily, ones of suffering and pain. So through the category of hysteria, Newman pinpoints what she sees as true in this text, some extreme medical condition of suffering and pain. And it's very close to, and is that, in fact, in modern philosophical discourse, transmutes into the kinds of suffering and pain that are associated with trauma. We might take Newman a step further and read Christina's hysteria as the result of trauma, of her suffering at the hands of family members, of her near death and burial, and of a guilt concomitant with the religious life in medieval Christianity. What's really real, then, would be Christina's suffering and her victimization, no matter how hyperbolically rendered. Yet in recording Christina's actions and her words, Thomas does not just record suffering and lamentation. There's some really gruesome suffering, but it's not all that's there. At times, he describes Christina as singing jubilantly in Latin. At other times, a more wondrous and indescribable sound emerges from her body. One Christina and the women around her, Cistercian nuns, have difficulty in interpreting. I'm going to read a long passage from the text and then end very briefly. Now, Christina was very familiar with the nuns of St. Catherine's outside the city of Saint-Trond. Sometimes while she was sitting with them, she would speak of Christ, and suddenly and unexpectedly she would be ravished in the spirit, and her body would whirl around like a hoop in a children's game. She whirled around with such extreme violence that the individual limbs of her body could not be distinguished. When she had whirled around for a long time in this manner, it seemed as if she became weakened by the violence of the rolling, and her limbs grew quiet. Then there sounded between her throat and her breast a wondrous harmony that no other mortal human being could understand, nor could it be imitated by any artificial instrument. That song of hers had only the pliancy and the tones of music. But the words of the melody, if they could even be called words, sounded altogether incomprehensibly. They sounded altogether incomprehensible, sounded as a verb there. No sound or breath came out of her mouth or nose during this time, but a harmony of the angelic voice resounded only from between her breast and her throat. While all this was happening, all of her limbs were quiet and her eyes were closed as if she were sleeping. Then, after a while, restored to herself somewhat, she rose up like one who was drunk. Indeed, she was drunk, and cried aloud, "Bring the nuns to me, that together we might praise Jesus for the great liberality of his miracles." Shortly thereafter, the nuns of the convent came running from all sides, for they greatly rejoiced in Christina's solace. And she began to sing the Te Deum Laudamus. Let us praise God. All the convent joined in as she finished her song. Afterwards, when she was fully restored to herself and learned from the others what she had done and how she had invited the community to praise Christ, she fled for shame and embarrassment. And if anyone forcibly detained her, she languished with great sorrow and declared herself stupid and foolish. What is unspeakable here is Christina's joy. Christina's vocalizations are grounded in the exuberance and order of song, but not reducible to that song. As in the Cashin's Conferences, the early monastic text that describes and gives a theological account of monastic practice, the individual in the monastery moves through corporate recitation of the Psalms, singing them all together, to an exaltation and a wordless song. And then through that wordless song back into the measured voices of the community. Christina depicts herself as participating in that monastic life, in the communal song, the solitary exaltation, and then the bringing back of that exaltation to the larger community. Here, I would say, lies the mystery of joy. And this is the aspect of this text, as with many other medieval texts, that modern historians have spent a woefully little amount of time attending to, thinking about, and trying to understand to what extent that joy is dependent on prior suffering, to what extent that joy might be seen as independent of and thinkable outside of the theology of suffering that runs throughout so much of the rest of Christina's life. Okay, thank you for your patience.